So as of now, we've taken a look at a few different options in terms of getting started with charting out and doing some technical analysis. So what we're going to do now is we're going to transition and combine all of those into um, one format. So we're going to take segmentation, support and resistance, supply and demand, and trend, and we're going to boil that all into one chart and drill down to a time frame that we're very interested in leveraging that for and see how all of that comes together. So this is more of a recap of everything we've done thus far to bring it together into one chart, and to see how all of it starts to formulate some confluence. So we're going to start on the weekly on the ES. And again, I'm not overly interested with doing a full markup of everything that's happening down here. I'm more so going to focus around what's happening currently. But to do so, I need to identify and start to build out areas that could have had an impact and made some decisions around segments prior to getting to where we're at. So I'll go through and do some baseline market segmentation. And again, precision doesn't overly matter here. It's just more about identifying where those major moves really happened and where the segments broke and formulated new segments. Because especially as you'll see, making that distinction becomes easier or less, I guess, less important when you're doing multiple things, right? So when we're looking at this as more of an all-inclusive chart, the individual segments matter less, and what matters more is the combination of all of those things together. So if we just go through and mark off segments that are important to us right from the get-go, we can then remove all of these. Okay, so we've got our major levels around us right now, and I'm going to focus on what's immediately above and below us. So this, let's say, segment high, we'll show the name on the right. And the purpose of this is just to give myself some differentiation and make it so that I can look at the chart very quickly and make decisions based around the strength of what I've identified. All right, so segments, as you'll recall, especially I know that I did my segmentation on the weekly. Segments, as you'll recall, are really indicative of breaks in the market that are substantial and create whole new sections of movement. So highlighting those as jumping out a little bit more makes sense, especially since it's a weekly chart. And that's the lowest I want to go right now because we're on a weekly chart that's so far away. So I can get rid of this. And now I can look through and see if there's anything else that might be worthwhile to throw on here. As we discussed, trend can be a very important tool. And I'm just looking at this and I don't love the red with the yellow going through. It's a bit clashy. And as we go to the lower time frames, I might change things around again just so that I can get better visibility. But it will be so spread out. The more time frames we drop, it won't matter a whole lot, but just for my own sanity right now. Okay, and I don't necessarily look at this and say there's much else that I want to do on the daily or the weekly, with the exception of maybe just some exclusive support and resistance, right? Not necessarily a important segment, but something that within a segment is really making an important distinction for itself. So now let's drop to the daily. Let's see if there's anything else that works itself out or shows itself that may be important for us to note. One thing that I will say is you can adjust your segments based on things that you notice, or you can add to them, right? So marking off segments on a weekly chart and then navigating down to like a 4 hour or a daily, you'll have some wiggle room. The exactness won't be there, but we can either, for instance, what I'm looking at now is this segment right here. We've got important levels all around it. We've got where we gapped up to right here, where we've got where we started our gap from. So you notice we've got a nice little section there, and if we zoom out at all, you'll see that this is actually a really nice change control zone. So I'm gonna get rid of that, or those two markings. I'm gonna leave the segment break in the middle, but I'm also gonna identify a change control zone, and I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger than what we originally identified, just because I see a little bit more when I zoom out. Okay, so we've got a change control zone with the segment right in the middle of it. And one thing that can also be very important to highlight is your gap. So let's edit that price level, and we'll just say that this is a gap level. And we'll get into gaps more and what they mean, but gaps have a tendency to fill at some point, right? Like you see, we came down and we tried a couple of times already with no luck, but gaps have a tendency to fill at some point. It can take forever. It can take a long time for a gap to fill, but they typically will fill. If we look at what's happening here, we could be identifying, preparing for a little bit of a squeeze or some more trend. And then furthermore, we could be looking at another piece of support and resistance here. So doing this helps us to identify that maybe, if we get some movement like this, sitting strong around the change control zone and then trending up a little bit. This is all obviously planning, and foreshadowing and making, educated decisions. But if we can get something right around here with, a third touch of a trend and that support and resistance level, then that's a really solid short option. And again, we're on the daily right now, so we're not even, whittled down to a smaller time frame. But our chart's starting to come together and really make some sense and some informed decisions. Looking below this level, looking below the change controls level, I can see another area of support and resistance, and you can see the chart's getting a little busy, but it's not cluttered. The chart's busy, but I look at this, right? Trend is, and you can see that actually what I was talking about with kind of snapping and exactness on the weekly and the daily. We drifted away, right? If we look at the weekly, that's probably going to look like we touched that perfectly. But if we drop to the daily, that point drifts a little bit. So let's just... One tip that I have is you can just connect the two and then extend to the right or the left. That helps quite a bit in staying exact. But as I was saying, we're on the daily chart now. It's starting to look a little bit cluttered. It's starting to look starting to look a little busy, but not cluttered. But every piece of information on this chart is helpful to me, right? I look at all of these, and I can very quickly identify that these are major areas and major segments that could have substantial volume around them. Trend is very easy to identify. We're in a long-term uptrend right here, but we haven't made that third test. We're also in a really short-term downtrend, but we haven't made that third test. So the market on the higher time frame is really squeezing to make a decision. There's been a lot of transactional volume in this area, further exasperated by the fact that we've got a gap right here, but also a segment up on top. So you can see that the speed at which we come out of those levels and the speed at which we transition through those levels is very quick, which indicates a very high volume within this zone. So I can make a lot of decisions and reads on the market just on the daily chart. And I will say there's probably not much else that I want to add on the lower time frames, but we can start going through. And what I would do in this case, starting to look on the lower time frames, is especially when we factor in Fibonacci, which is something that we'll get into next and is arguably the most important thing, but you don't want to go into it too quickly without solid baselines, is the shorter time frames we go into, the more likely I am to start changing around and getting very specific with my labels, right? So we're on a 4-hour chart right now. And I'll change up some colors to make some distinctions. It's going to yell at me because that's a little too long. 4-hour. Let's just change this. 4H in the middle of traffic. Right, so it's not been respected. It used to be respected very well. It's not so much anymore once we got around here. But there's really not enough there to build a zone yet. So I'm going to put less importance on this. This level right here, up until the most recent pass through, held very well. So what we can do is again, I'll use that same color just to keep it flat with the time frame. Let's show the name on the right. It hasn't really acted as support, but actually what I'm looking at now is on the 4-hour. I'm going to get rid of this, or I'm going to leave that for the moment, but it will be going away quickly, is actually we started to drift up high and give ourselves a nice little zone up here. There's no supply or demand. It's exclusively change control. And I guess I can leave that in the middle since the zone did become a little larger. And now what we have is when we go down to the hourly, right? Obviously ignore this very, very large movement. We can factor in another gap here that has filled. And you can see that this is very interesting. You can see that when we did fill the gap, it was an instantaneous touch, and then a lot of transactions around that brought it right up to our next level, which had already been established. So this, let's just say hourly gap filled, and again you can see that I'm getting a little bit more explicit with my verbiage around what I'm throwing on the chart. But again, as I was mentioning, the closer you get and the lower time frames you get, the more spread out this becomes. And everything that we outlined on a 4-hour chart, daily chart, weekly chart now becomes a map and a blueprint for us to make decisions as we're moving through those levels, and kind of it's basically guiding us to make decisions through those levels. So This was just kind of like a recap and reaffirmation of how you can implement all of these things and start to work yourself down to more intraday charts. We haven't introduced fibs yet. We haven't introduced advanced patterns or anything. It's mostly just been the tried and true basics, and you can trade very successfully off of just this. So what I'd ideally like is you all to go through and start mapping this stuff out. Start on the weekly and drop yourself into a 4 hour or an hourly, making decisions along the way, with the goal being both a readable chart when you get down to the 4 hour and hourly, but also an uncluttered chart. So you want that nice balance and what makes sense to you. Colors of your chart, all of the way that your price levels are identified and trend is identified, all of that in an easily readable way to you. This is very configurable. And all of it can be done through both this little settings section here in terms of setting like your background coloring and really truly play around with it. And then you can edit all of these as they come through, right? You can edit the color, the style, the weight, all of it. So really take some time and play with it. The goal being giving yourself a very readable and uncluttered chart, but one that helps you make decisions.